The dust of Bitter Creek hung in the noonday air like a funeral shroud, thick enough to taste iron and grit on the tongue. The sun blazed merciless overhead, a white coin hammered into a sky bleached of color, turning the main street into a ribbon of baked earth that shimmered with heat waves. The storefronts stood weathered and silent, their windows reflecting nothing but empty sky and the occasional shadow of a face withdrawn quickly from view. No one moved. No one spoke. But eyes watched from behind those windows, the way frontier towns watched when trouble walked among them, when violence hung in the air, like the promise of thunder. Then came the running. The sound cut through the heat, small feet slapping hard-packed dirt, frantic and uneven. A child's voice, high and breaking, gasping between sobs that shook her whole body. She was perhaps 5 years old, small for her age, with tangled blonde hair that had escaped its braids and hung wild around a face streaked with tears and trail dust. Her prairie dress, once blue calico, was torn at the hem and stained with rust-colored earth. Her feet were bare bloodied from rocks she'd run across without feeling, and her eyes wide and desperate, fixed on a single point ahead, with the terrified focus of prey seeking shelter. Behind her, stumbling, came a woman. Young, maybe 24, but worn in the way the frontier wore women down, grinding them between hardship and fear, until they aged a decade in a year. Matilda Quinn fell to one elbow in the middle of the street, her chest heaving, unable to draw enough air. Her dress, dark wool that was far too heavy for the summer heat, clung to her legs with sweat and dust. Dark hair escaped its pins in wild tangles, and her face, pale beneath the grime, bore the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had been running far longer than just today. She reached out one shaking hand toward the child, her mouth opening to call out, but her voice emerged only as a rasp swallowed by the rattle in her lungs. The little girl's eyes locked on a figure standing near the hitching post outside the general store. He was tall and lean, dressed in an elk-hide jacket with long fringe that swayed as he turned toward the sound. A red headband held back black hair that fell past his shoulders in the Apache way, and his face, high cheekbones, strong jaw, copper skin, marked by sun and wind, showed no surprise and only a calm and instant assessment that came from years spent reading danger in silence. He was Apache. His name was Shyla, though few in Bitter Creek knew it or cared to ask. To most, he was simply the scout, the one who guided freight wagons through the treacherous passes when no white man would risk it. The child flung herself at him with the desperation of the drowning reaching for driftwood, with the absolute faith of a child who has been told, "There is one person in the world who will not turn away." Shyla dropped to one knee without hesitation, bringing himself to her height in a single smooth motion. Her small body crashed into his chest, and her fingers clutched at the fringe of his jacket, as though it were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath her feet. Her breath came in hitching sobs that shook her ribs, and her whole body trembled with exhaustion and terror. "Mama said find you," she gasped, her voice breaking on every word. Tears cut clean tracks through the dust on her round cheeks. "Your papa," she said. "She said you're my papa. Please, please don't let them take us." Shyla's dark eyes flicked past her to the woman in the street, then swept the buildings with the predator's awareness of being watched. His hand came up instinctively to steady the child's back, broad palm spanning her narrow shoulders. He felt her heartbeat hammering against his ribs like a bird's wings beating against a cage. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. Dust kicked up 6 inches from Shyla's heel, the slug burying itself in the hard-packed earth with a sound like a stone thrown into mud. He moved without flourish, without wasted motion. One arm scooped the child fully into the shelter of his body. The other angled his shoulder and back to form a wall between her and the rooftops. A second shot whined past, close enough to feel the air snap and the heat of its passage. He turned his head slowly, deliberately measuring the street with the patience of a man who had survived worse and knew that panic killed faster than bullets. Behind him, Matilda dragged herself to her knees, her dress catching beneath her, and lifted one trembling hand toward him. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, raw and desperate, scraped from a throat gone dry with fear and sickness. "Please," she said. The word hung in the hot air, weighted with more than desperation. It carried the burden of every failed escape, every locked door, every night she had lain awake, wondering if her daughter would grow up in the same cage. "Help us. I'm begging you. Help us." In the doorway of the Rusty Nail Saloon, 2 stories of false front and peeling paint that dominated the east side of the street, a man stepped into the light. Crooked Miles. He wore a waistcoat of dark brocade, despite the heat, 3 rings on his left hand that caught the sun in winking flashes of gold, and carried a silver flask that he lifted in a mocking salute. His smile was thin and satisfied, the smile of a man watching a rat run into a corner he'd built himself, brick by brick. At his side stood Sheriff Dave Calder, called Dark Dave by those who knew his work and feared his name. Calder's hand rested easy on the stock of a Winchester propped against his hip, his badge glinting dull on his vest. He was broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cold calculation in his eyes the color of river ice, flat and pitiless. On the post beside them, a fresh printed notice flapped in the hot breeze: "Reward, Apache abductor. $200 dangerous." Calder's voice carried across the street, smooth and unhurried, the tone of a man who knew he held all the cards. "That's my property you're holding, Injun. The woman owes a debt. The child stays with her. You hand them over now, and I'll forget this sun-baked foolishness. You don't, and we'll add horse thieving to kidnapping and see how you like a rope." Shyla's gaze settled on Calder. He did not speak. He did not move. The child's heartbeat hammered against his chest, fast and terrified, and he felt the weight of her fear like a stone in his gut. The woman in the street lifted her chin, meeting his eyes across the distance, and in that look was a dare him to walk away, dare him to prove the world as cold and cruel as she feared it was, dare him to be different. Shyla's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, planted his feet in the dust, and did not let go. Shyla had no intention of staying in Bitter Creek longer than an hour. He never did. The town was a place of necessity, not preference, a stop for salt coffee powder for the old Sharps rifle he carried wrapped in oilcloth, and occasionally to trade beadwork at the general store for coin or goods he couldn't make himself. He was a scout by trade and by temperament, hired by freighters to guide supply wagons through Willow Gap and along the San Pedro River routes, where the trails grew treacherous and the markers few. He knew every canyon, every seep spring, every place where the land turned hostile without warning. The work suited him. It asked for silent skill and solitude, all things he had learned to prefer after Bluebird Crossing. He did not speak of Bluebird Crossing. Few knew the story, and he did not offer it. What mattered was the scar, a white lattice cross-hatching his left forearm, where an arrowhead had shattered against bone during a skirmish with a raiding band 6 years past. The same fight had cost him his wife Nashoda and the child she carried. They had been camped near the spring when the attack came at dawn. He had fought, killed 3 men, taken the arrow that should have killed him. But while he fought, Nashoda had run and been caught. They found her body 2 days later, half buried in a dry wash. The child had died with her. He did not speak of it. He kept the fringe on his jacket clean, not from vanity, but from pride, a way of saying he had not been broken, even when the breaking had come close. He wore the scar where others could see it, a reminder that survival came at a cost. He had ridden into Bitter Creek that morning to check the telegraph office for word from Green Valley about a supply train escort. The job would take him north for 2 weeks. Good pay, straightforward work, guiding a freight run through territory most white men feared. He had planned to collect his reply trade, a string of beaded bracelets for powder and coffee, and be gone by noon. Then the child had run to him, and the shots had come, and the plan had shattered like glass. Matilda Quinn had come west on a lie so carefully crafted it had felt like truth. She had been a seamstress in St. Louis, 21 years old, and alone after her mother's death from cholera. The boarding house where she rented a room was closing, and the factory where she sewed 12 hours a day for pennies was laying off half its workers. When the letter arrived, carefully penned on good paper, the handwriting elegant and confident, it had seemed like Providence. Dear Miss Quinn, I am a widower farmer, seeking a wife to share a modest but honest life near Bitter Creek. The land is hard but fair, and I believe a woman of character and skill would find contentment here. If you are willing, I would be honored to make your acquaintance, and God willing offer you a home and a future. The letters had continued arriving every 2 weeks with reassuring regularity. The man who signed himself Thomas Garrett spoke of his small homestead, his late wife, who had died in childbirth, his loneliness tempered by faith and hard work. He asked thoughtful questions about her skills, her hopes, her faith. He sent a tintype photograph of a man in his 40s, weathered but kind-eyed, standing before a neat cabin. It was not the photograph of Thomas Garrett. It was an image purchased from a traveling photographer's discard pile. Matilda had saved every cent from her sewing, packed a single trunk with her mother's quilt and her few dresses, and boarded the stage west with hope knotted tight in her chest and a ring on her finger, a plain band she'd bought herself, so she'd arrive as a woman spoken for, not a desperate spinster. When she stepped off the stage in Bitter Creek, Thomas Garrett did not exist. Instead, Crooked Miles had been waiting with a smile and a room at the Rusty Nail. The room came with a billboard dress suitable for the climate, a doctor's visit for the cough that had started on the long journey west. The debts piled fast, penned in an elegant hand by Grigory Karpov, the clerk who had written every one of the lies that lured her there. The doors locked behind her. The windows were barred. And when she tried to leave, Calder's men brought her back. That had been 3 years ago. Violet had not been part of the plan. Violet was what remained of an earlier life, a harder life. Born in the mining camp at Dead Man's Gulch to a French-born miner named Baptiste Laurent, who had loved Matilda with the quiet intensity of a man who believed he could build a future from rock and sweat. Baptiste had been 28 strong and hopeful, with a gentle voice and rough hands scarred from pickaxe and blasting powder. He had promised her a home, a life away from the camps. He had died 3 months before Violet was born, buried under 2 tons of rock and timber in a shaft that had been rigged to fail. The camp's magistrate had noted the death in a logbook, Cave-in Shaft 7B. Laurent, aged 28, and moved on. No investigation, no questions. The mine paid Matilda $20 in settlement and told her to leave by the end of the week. She had come to Bitter Creek because the letters promised safety, and she had stayed because there was no way out. Until now, Bitter Creek squatted at the edge of the high desert like a dog too stubborn to lie down and die. The town had been nothing 15 years ago, just a relay station for the stage line and a trading post where trappers sold pelts and drank rotgut whiskey. Then they found silver in the hills, and the miners came and the merchants followed, and within 5 years, Bitter Creek had a main street, a church, a school, and 3 saloons. The railroad reached it 2 years ago, and that changed everything. Freight came through now, supplies heading west or heading east, and with freight came money, and with money came men like Miles who knew how to take it. The town had law, but the law belonged to Calder. He wore the badge, collected the taxes, kept order in the way that suited Miles's interests. The good folk of Bitter Creek, the shopkeepers, the farmers at the edges, the few families who had come honestly seeking land, lived quietly and paid what they owed, and did not ask too many questions about the women who worked upstairs at the Rusty Nail, or the debts that never seemed to clear. There were 3 such folk who mattered now, though they did not yet know it. Dr. Irene Fowler kept her shingle plain and her practice quiet. She had trained back east in a small medical college and came west for the work no man would take, carrying her instruments in a worn leather case. She was a woman physician in a world that did not trust women with scalpels, and she had learned to work in the margins, treating the injuries that men like Calder preferred to ignore, asking no questions when the answers might bring trouble. She was 40, unmarried, with gray, streaking her dark hair, and a steady hand, born of necessity. She owed Miles for the loan that had bought her medical instruments 3 years ago. $200 at 15% interest compounded quarterly a debt that had grown to $400 and showed no sign of shrinking. She hated the owing. She hated more what it made her complicit in. Winifred Hale taught school in a one-room building at the edge of town, where the dust blew in through the cracks and the winter cold made the children's breath fog. She was 26, unmarried, pale and bookish, with chalk dust perpetually on her cuffs and a tremor in her hands that worsened when Calder stopped by to check on the children. She had come west 2 years ago with a teaching certificate and a salary of $30 a month paid by the county. Miles owned the building. He did not charge rent, but he made it clear that the arrangement depended on her cooperation. She owed him nothing in money. In fear, she owed him everything. Arthur Pike was a sod-buster with a failing well at Drought Creek, 5 miles east of town. He was 50, bent from 30 years of labor, with gnarled hands and a back that seized up in cold weather. He had a mule named Bess, a shotgun older than his daughter would have been, and a stubborn refusal to quit. His crops came in thin, his water thinner, and he owed Miles for seed and for a loan taken 3 winters past, when the snows had buried his barn and killed half his stock. The debt was $150. He paid $10 a year. Miles smiled when he came to collect and reminded Arthur that the land could always be sold if things got too hard. These 3, Irene, Winifred, Arthur, would matter before the end. They would choose when choosing came, and their choices would tip the balance. Shyla had seen Matilda once before, though she did not know he remembered. It had been late summer, maybe a year ago. He had come to town to trade beadwork bracelets and rings made from glass beads. He bought from the post patterns his mother had taught him in the old way, white for protection, red for courage, turquoise for home. He sold them for pennies to women who liked the look and did not ask where they came from. He had been loading supplies onto his horse when he heard the sound, a woman's voice sharp with fear and a man's laughter low and ugly. He had turned to see a drunk one of Miles's regulars grab Matilda's wrist outside the general store and pull her toward the alley with the casual cruelty of a man who believed he had the right. She had pulled back her face pale, her voice rising in protest. Shyla had crossed the street in 4 long strides, caught the drunk's forearm in a grip that made bone creak and twisted until the man let go. The drunk had cursed, swung wild, and Shyla had sidestepped, hooked the man's ankle, and put him face down in the dirt without drawing a weapon or raising his voice. Then he had let go, mounted his horse, when ridden out without a word. Matilda had stood with one hand pressed to her bruised wrist, staring after him, and she had remembered. When desperation finally came, when she clutched the torn ledger page in her hands and knew she had one chance to run, she had told Violet a lie, born of necessity and hope. Find the man with the fringe jacket, the one who helped me. Tell him Mama said to find you. Tell him he's your papa. It was a lie. But lies, when spoken by the desperate to save a child, sometimes carry their own kind of truth. In the back office of the Rusty Nail, Grigory Karpov sat hunched over a ledger, his pen scratching neat columns of names and debts. He was a small man, pale and thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles that slipped down his nose and ink stains permanently etched into his fingertips. He had been a clerk in Kiev before he came west, running from debts of his own. He had found work with Miles because he wrote beautifully and asked no questions, and could forge a signature so perfectly even a judge couldn't tell the difference. He did not like his work, but he did it well, and he told himself that keeping the books clean was not the same as keeping the blood off his hands. It was a lie he believed most days. One entry written 6 months ago read, "Matilda Quinn, $45 board $3 dress, $12, doctor $25, rescue fee D. Calder." Another older read, "Blasting compound test, Laurent $40. Shaft 7 rigged for controlled collapse. Payment to DC for witness elimination." Below it, MQ debt transfer child leverage. Violet Laurent DOB recorded as father unknown per camp record. Useful for retention. Karpov closed the book, locked it in the desk, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He did not look at the names long. It was easier that way. Behind the water trough, at the edge of the street, Shyla crouched with the child Violet, the woman had called her, pressed against his chest, and the woman Matilda huddled at his side, her shoulder against his, her breath coming fast and shallow. Above them, buckshot chewed splinters from the trough's rim, peppering the air with fragments of wood. Calder's voice drifted across the street again, smooth and unbothered, the tone of a man who had all the time in the world. "Hand over my property, Injun, and I'll forget this sun-baked foolishness. Otherwise, we're going to have ourselves a situation, and you're going to be on the wrong end of it." Matilda turned to Shyla, her face inches from his, her eyes wide and desperate. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the shadows beneath them, and the way her lips were cracked from sun and dehydration. She reached inside her bodice with shaking fingers and pulled out a folded page, torn, creased, covered in precise script. "They'll take her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They'll take me back and I'll never get out. She'll grow up there. Please. I know I don't have the right to ask, but..." Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, forced the words out. "Please, I'm begging you. Help us." Shyla took the page, unfolded it with one hand, while keeping his body angled to shield them, and read. The script was elegant, the numbers precise. Names listed like stock women, debts payments. One line jumped out, "Matilda Quinn, $45 board, 3 dress $12, doctor $25, rescue fee, signed D. Calder." He studied it without expression, absorbing the information the way he absorbed terrain, cataloging, assessing, deciding. Then he folded it again and tucked it inside his jacket next to the Colt revolver he carried but rarely used. Violet's small hand clutched something, a ring he saw now, beaded in white and red and turquoise. Apache work. His work likely sold months ago for a few cents. She held it like a talisman, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Shyla met Matilda's gaze. Her eyes were brown, he noticed, dark and clear despite the fear. There was steel beneath the desperation, the kind of strength that came from enduring and refusing to break. He made his decision. "You run when I stand," he said quietly, his voice low and even. "Stay low. Follow me." Matilda nodded, her breath hitching. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Violet's small voice, muffled against his chest, said, "Papa?" Shyla's jaw tightened. He did not correct her. There was no time. He rose slow, drawing eyes, his body a deliberate target, buying seconds. Then he kicked the trough hard with his boot heel. Water sluiced out in a flood, rushing across the street, and in the confusion, the shouts, the splashing, they ran. They moved through the narrow alleys and back lanes like ghosts, Shyla leading with the instinct of a man who had spent his life reading terrain and predicting pursuit. He knew which paths were watched and which were forgotten, where the buildings sagged enough to slip between, where a man could move unseen if he moved with purpose. He tossed a barrel into the gap behind the blacksmith shed, wedging it across the narrow space to slow anyone following. The crash echoed, and he heard boots pounding closer. Violet clung to his neck, her legs wrapped around his ribs, her face buried in his shoulder. She did not cry. She had learned not to. Matilda ran behind him, her skirt hiked up in both hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cough threatened to break loose, but she swallowed it down, forcing air through her nose, focusing on his back and the fringe swaying the steady rhythm of his stride. He vaulted a hitching rail, turned, and lifted Violet across in one smooth motion, his hands under her ribs. Then he reached back for Matilda. She stumbled on the rail, her boot catching, and he caught her elbow, steadying her with a quick, firm grip that sent a jolt of awareness through them both. The first spark of something neither had time to name, born from necessity, and the sudden visceral realization that they were trusting each other with their lives. "Keep moving," he said, and she nodded, gasping, and ran. The livery was chaos. Arthur Pike's mule, a cantankerous beast named Bess, with a white blaze and one drooping ear, brayed and stamped, hitched to a flatbed wagon loaded with grain sacks and farm tools. Arthur himself stood wide-eyed in the doorway, reins in one gnarled hand, staring as Shyla appeared at a dead run with a woman and child behind him. "What in tarnation?" Arthur started. "Need your wagon," Shyla said, not slowing his voice flat with urgency. "Take her." Arthur thrust the reins at him, his face flushing with sudden fierce decision. "Mule's all I got, but she's yours. Get those folks out of here." Shyla hauled Matilda and Violet into the wagon bed, vaulted up beside Arthur's seat, and snatched the reins. Bess brayed in protest, but he snapped the leather hard, and she lurched forward with a jolt that sent grain sacks sliding. Behind them, boots hammered the street, and Calder's voice rose in a shout. A rifle cracked. The slug buzzed past Shyla's ear like an angry hornet and punched through the wagon's sideboards. Splinters flew. Violet screamed. He hunched lower, whipped the reins again, and Bess hit her stride hooves drumming hard against the packed earth. Another shot. This one kissed Shyla's left bicep, tearing through buckskin and flesh in a white-hot line of pain. He felt the impact, felt the blood bloom hot and immediate, but did not slow. The pain was distant, manageable. He had been hurt worse. Violet's eyes went wide, fixed on the spreading red stain. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice small and scared. "Papa, you're bleeding." Matilda tore a strip from the hem of her skirt without hesitation, her hands shaking but sure. She reached across the jolting wagon bed and bound his arm tight, her fingers brushing his bare skin where the buckskin had torn away. The contact was warm, quick, necessary, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not attraction, not yet, but the primal recognition of alliance of two people choosing to trust when trust was the only currency they had. "Hold on." Shyla said, his voice tight, and the wagon rattled east toward open country. Calder rode with purpose and a posse at his back. 3 hired guns drifters in threadbare army cast-offs, drunk more often than sober, but mean enough to follow orders for $5 a day and the promise of whiskey. With them rode Smooth Sam Holloway, a bounty man with a Winchester 1873 rifle, and a reputation for never missing twice. Sam was quiet, efficient, and had once tracked a man 300 miles through snow. He did not care about justice. He cared about the $200 Miles had offered for the return of Matilda Quinn and the death of the Apache who took her. They pushed hard across the open prairie, raising a plume of dust that could be seen for miles. The land here was scarred by barbed wire, new fences strung by miles to control the open range part of the fence-cutting conflicts that had turned old cattle trails into death traps and ruined more than one rancher who refused to pay for passage. The wire gleamed dull in the sun, strung low and vicious. The wagon hit a rut, jolted hard, and the front axle caught a strand. The wire snapped with a sound like a gunshot whipping back in a vicious arc. It lashed Arthur's left forearm, slicing through his sleeve, and the skin beneath opening a gash that ran from wrist to elbow. Blood welled instantly, bright and shocking. Arthur shouted, his face going gray. Bess reared her eyes, rolling white, and the wagon tilted dangerously. Shyla threw his weight onto the trace boots, braced against the footboard muscles, straining to keep the wagon upright. Grain sacks slid and tumbled. Violet clung to his neck, her small fingers digging into his skin, her breath hot and terrified against his throat. A scatter of shots rang out from behind, 5-6, the reports cracking flat across the open ground. Slugs kicked up dirt, splintered wood sang through the air with the high, deadly whine of lead-seeking flesh. Matilda grabbed Arthur's battered Colt from the floorboards, thumbed the hammer with both hands, and raised it. The revolver was old, the bluing worn, the grips cracked. She had never fired a gun in her life. She pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked the weapon from her hand, and the report deafening the muzzle flash, bright even in daylight. The shot went wide, disappearing into the prairie. She gasped, her wrists aching, and steadied her grip with shaking hands. Shyla moved behind her, his chest against her back, his arms coming around to cover her hands with his own. His palms were rough, his fingers calloused, and his grip was firm and sure. He adjusted the angle of the barrel, his voice low in her ear, steady and calm. "Breathe," he said. "Focus on the man, not the horse. Breathe out. Squeeze." She felt his heartbeat against her shoulder blades, felt the warmth of his body and the cool rush of adrenaline. And for one brief electric moment, the chaos fell away. She breathed out. She squeezed. The shot took a rider's hat clean off his head. The man ducked, swore, and his horse shied sideways, breaking the line. It bought them 50 yards, maybe more. The contact lingered hand over hand, breath against breath, the press of his body sheltering hers. Then the moment broke, and they were moving again, the wagon bouncing over uneven ground, Bess braying and straining against the reins. At Dry Wash, the land dropped into a shallow ravine choked with saltbush and rabbit brush. The soil was cracked and pale, and the air smelled of sage and dust. Shyla hauled the wagon to a stop, vaulted down, and pulled Matilda and Violet after him. Arthur followed, clutching his bleeding arm, his face slick with sweat. "Under the brush," Shyla said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." They crawled beneath the scrub, the branches scratching their skin and the ground hot beneath their bellies. Above them, the posse thundered past, hooves shaking the earth, voices shouting back and forth. Dust hung thick in the air, choking and hot, and they pressed their faces into their arms to keep from coughing. The sound faded. Silence settled, broken only by the hiss of wind through dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk. Matilda began to cough, deep, rattling spasms that bent her forward and brought tears to her eyes. She pressed both hands over her mouth, trying to muffle the sound, but the coughing would not stop. Her shoulders shook, her breath wheezed. Shyla moved beside her, propped her upright with one hand at her back, and patted a slow, steady rhythm between her shoulder blades. "Keep air," he murmured, his voice low and calm. "In through your nose, slow." She nodded, gasping, tears streaming, and gradually the fit eased. When she could breathe again, she sagged against him, exhausted, her forehead resting briefly against his shoulder. He did not pull away. His hand stayed on her back a moment longer than necessary, a gesture of care that neither acknowledged and neither forgot. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. He nodded, once his gaze already scanning the horizon for dust. Night fell fast on the high plains, the sky turning from blue to purple to black in the space of an hour. Stars appeared hard and bright, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Shyla led them east by starlight, following dry creek beds and ridges he knew by memory, navigating by the shape of the land and the pull of distant mountains. By midnight, they reached an old drift mine above Rain Valley, a played-out silver claim with a boarded entrance half hidden by juniper and scrub oak. He pried the boards loose with his knife, ushered them inside, and struck a match. The interior was dry and cold, the air tasting of stone and old powder, and something else iron maybe, or the faint mineral tang of ore long since extracted. Timber beams held the ceiling, and side pockets branched off into darkness. Shyla built a small fire from deadfall he'd cached months before, keeping the flames low and the smoke thin. The light flickered across the rough-hewn walls, throwing shadows that moved like living things. Violet curled against Matilda's side, shivering despite the blanket Arthur had thrown into the wagon before they fled. Her eyes were wide and watchful, too old for a child of 5, and she clutched the beaded ring in one small fist. Matilda wrapped her arms around her daughter and whispered soft reassurances, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Footsteps echoed at the entrance an hour later. Shyla's hand went to his knife, his body tensing, and then a woman's voice called softly from the darkness. "It's Irene. Don't shoot." Dr. Irene Fowler ducked through the low-opening medical bag in hand. She was followed by Arthur Pike, limping and pale, his forearm wrapped in a bloodied cloth. Irene's face was tight with worry and determination, her gray-streaked hair escaping its pins, her skirt dusty from the climb. She knelt beside Shyla without preamble, set down her bag, and began laying out instruments by firelight. "Let me see that arm." Shyla extended his bicep. The blood had dried, crusting the torn buckskin, but the wound beneath was clean, a furrow not deep but long. Irene threaded a needle with catgut, dipped it in carbolic, and began to stitch without asking permission. Her hands were steady, her stitches small and even. "Hold still," she said. Shyla did not flinch. He watched the flames, his jaw set, and breathed slow and even as the needle pierced his skin again and again. When she finished, she tied off the thread, bandaged the wound with clean linen, and moved to Arthur's arm. "This is worse," she said bluntly, inspecting the gash. "You'll have a scar, but I can close it. You're lucky it didn't take the tendon." Arthur grunted. "Lucky's one word for it." When she finished with Arthur, Irene turned to Matilda, pulled out a stethoscope, and listened to her lungs. The sound was wet, congested, and Irene's expression tightened. "Consumption?" Shyla asked quietly. Irene shook her head. "Not full-blown, but the seeds are there. She needs rest, clean air medicine I don't have here." She met Matilda's eyes. "Can you travel?" "I'll have to," Matilda said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Irene nodded. "Then do what he says. He'll keep you alive longer than I can." The next day, deeper in the mine, they found something that changed everything. In a side pocket hidden behind a collapsed ore cart and half buried under rockfall were wooden crates stamped "Rusty Nail Bitter Creek" in black stencil. Shyla pried one open with his knife, the nails screeching as they gave. Inside stacked and bundled letters, dozens of them. Letters from women back east, hopeful, earnest, asking about husbands and homesteads and futures. Beside them, replies in an elegant flowing hand, each one a careful lie. Matilda pulled one out, her hands shaking, and read aloud. Her voice cracked on the words. "Dear Miss Sarah, your journey west will be met with open arms and a home prepared. The farm is small but honest, and I await your arrival with great anticipation. Yours in faith, Thomas Garrett." She looked up, her face pale. "There is no Thomas Garrett." "No," Shyla said quietly. "Just Miles, and whoever writes for him." Arthur swore softly. "How many?" Shyla counted the bundles. "Dozens, maybe more." They sat in silence, the weight of it settling over them like ash. That evening, as the sun set and the temperature dropped, Winifred Hale arrived. She stumbled into the mine entrance, breathless and trembling, her dress torn at the hem, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She carried a wrapped parcel clutched to her chest like a lifeline. "I walked," she gasped, her voice breaking. 3 miles. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. She unwrapped the parcel. Inside were more ledger pages, torn carefully from the binding, the edges ragged. She had stolen them from the Rusty Nail's back office, while Smooth Sam had been distracted at the bar, flirting with one of the girls. Her hands shook as she handed them to Matilda. "I'm done being quiet," Winifred said, her voice cracking but firm. "I'm done pretending I don't see." Matilda took the pages, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you. Blast it, thank you." Winifred stayed long enough to give Violet a slate and chalk, showing her how to write letters, simple shapes at first, then words. The child bent over the slate with fierce concentration, her tongue between her teeth, practicing ABC. It kept her still and silent, which was all they could ask. Shyla and Matilda worked side by side through the long hours, copying the ledger pages by lantern light. His handwriting was blocky and careful, the letters formed with effort. Hers was fine and quick, the penmanship of a woman who had once earned her living with needle and thread, and had learned to write receipts and invoices in a steady, legible hand. They sat close shoulders, nearly touching, the warmth of the fire at their backs and the cold of the mine pressing in from the darkness. When he needed a fresh page, she handed it to him. When her hand cramped, he brought her water in a tin cup, the metal cool against her palms. When the lantern flickered low, she held the wick steady while he trimmed it with his knife. Between them, something shifted, small and wordless, built from necessity and proximity, and the slow-growing awareness that they were no longer strangers bound by circumstance, but allies choosing to trust. A borrowed blanket when the night wind turned cold. A pause too long when she tucked Violet in and turned to find him already watching, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. A moment when their fingers brushed over a shared pencil and neither pulled away. Matilda spoke quietly, her eyes on the page, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "Years ago, maybe a year, maybe more, a man grabbed me outside the store. He was drunk. He wanted... It doesn't matter what he wanted. You stopped him. You didn't ask for thanks. You just did what was right, and then you left." Shyla looked at her, his expression unreadable. She met his gaze, her eyes steady despite the fear beneath. "I kept a button from that day. It fell from his coat when you threw him down. I kept it like a charm, something to remind me that not everyone in this town was cruel. I told Violet your name when I ran out of promises, when I didn't know what else to say to keep her brave." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Why me?" "Because you didn't look at me like I was something broken. You looked at me like I was a person." Her voice cracked. "I lied to my daughter because the truth wouldn't keep her safe. But you saved me anyway. That's real." He said nothing, but after a moment he nodded once, a gesture that said more than words could. Samuel Mercer arrived at dawn, slipping through the mine entrance like a shadow. He was a wiry man in his 40s, with ink-stained fingers, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a nervous habit of adjusting them every few seconds. He worked the telegraph at the depot, tapping out messages for freight companies and ranchers and the occasional traveler. He had seen the ledgers before Miles kept a second set of books that passed through the depot for shipment to contacts in Denver and San Francisco. Samuel had said nothing. Until now. He studied the copied pages Matilda handed him, his lips pressed thin, his face pale. "If I send this, Calder will come for me." "How long?" Shyla asked. 30 seconds to tap out the message. Maybe 5 minutes before he knows. "Will it reach Green Valley?" "If the line's clear. Marshal Harlan's based there. A telegraph had gone out at dusk with sworn statements. The morning local brought him down the line before the town could change its story. He's federal, and he doesn't owe Miles anything." Samuel met Shyla's eyes. "But once I send it, I'm a dead man." "Then don't," Shyla said flatly. Samuel shook his head. I've been quiet too long. If this works, if it brings the law down on Miles, it'll be the first honest thing I've done in years. He folded the pages into his coat and tipped his hat. Give me until noon. He left before sunrise. Shyla watched him go, a thin figure against the gray dawn, and felt the weight of what they were asking him to risk. 2 days later, Winifred returned. She was alone, pale, her breath coming in gasps, and she stumbled into the mine and stood trembling by the fire, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I found more, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. In the ledgers. I read them all. Matilda straightened, dread tightening in her chest. What did you find? Winifred pulled a folded page from inside her coat. Her hands shook so hard the paper rattled. Your husband, Baptiste. The cave-in. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't an accident. The words hung in the cold air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Matilda went very still. What? Winifred unfolded the page, her voice cracking as she read. Blasting compound test, Laurent, $40. Marked the day before he died. Shaft rigged for controlled collapse. She swallowed hard. Below it, MQ debt transfer, child leverage. Violet Laurent DOB recorded as father unknown per camp record. Useful for retention. Matilda's face drained of color. She swayed, caught herself against the mine wall with one hand, and pressed the other to her mouth as though to hold back a scream. They killed him, she whispered, her voice breaking. They killed him for $40 and took me because I had a child they could use. Shyla moved to her side, his hand at her elbow, steadying her. She flinched and then turned to him, and the truth spilled out in a rush, all the lies and desperation and fear she had carried alone. Violet isn't yours. Her voice broke on the words, tears streaming. I lied. I told her you were her father because I hoped you'd protect her if you believed it. But she's Baptiste's daughter. She's all I have left of him, and I used your name to keep her safe. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The betrayal landed like a blow. Shyla stepped back, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. He turned toward the mine entrance and stood there, silhouetted against the gray light, his shoulders rigid. The silence stretched cold and heavy. Matilda watched him, her heart hammering, waiting for him to walk away, to leave them to face Calder alone, to prove that the world was exactly as cruel as she feared. When he turned back, the hardness was still there, but so was something else. A choice made, a line drawn. Then we show them the page, he said quietly. We finish this. Matilda's breath hitched. You're still? Blood or no blood? Shyla said, his voice flat and final. She ran to me. You asked me for help. That's enough. The air between them tightened, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with something rougher and truer. Commitment by action. Trust earned not through words, but through the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. He did not forgive the lie, but he chose to see past it. And that choice, more than any declaration, bound them together in a way that could not be undone. Matilda pressed both hands to her face and wept, not from relief, but from the overwhelming weight of being seen. Being chosen, being trusted despite everything. Violet looked up from her slate, her small face serious. Papa's not leaving. Shyla knelt beside her, his expression softening. No, I'm not leaving. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her letters. Samuel Mercer sent the wire at noon, his fingers flying over the telegraph key with swift, practiced motions. The message was short-coded, urgent federal assistance required. Evidence of trafficking and fraud. Request Marshal Harlan S.M. The partial transmission raised suspicion in Green Valley. It took a full day for the federal marshal to respond with a query, "Clarify." What evidence? By then, Calder had already seen the sounder clacking and stormed the depot with Smooth Sam and 2 others. Samuel tried to stall, rambling about line troubles and maintenance, his hands shaking as he adjusted his spectacles. But Calder was not a patient man. He grabbed Samuel by the collar, dragged him from behind the counter, and threw him into the street. The beating was methodical and public, a lesson delivered with fists and boots, each blow calculated to break without killing too quickly. When it was done, Samuel lay crumpled in the dust, blood pooling beneath his cheek, his spectacles shattered beside him. Calder left him there as a warning, and the townsfolk watched from windows and doorways, silent and ashamed. Miles posted a new notice that afternoon, nailed to the post outside the saloon. Wanted Apache kidnapper, dangerous, $200 reward. Smooth Sam took 3 men and followed the wagon ruts east toward Rain Valley. They found the mine at dusk when the light was failing and the shadows grew long. Smooth Sam had tracked them by broken brush and the faint marks of the wagon wheels in the dry soil. He was good at his work. He positioned his men on the ridge above the mine entrance, rifles ready, and waited until full dark to make his move. Gunfire erupted without warning, bullets slamming into the rock face, ricocheting off stone with high, deadly whines filling the air with the stink of powder and the sharp crack of reports echoing off the canyon walls. Shyla, Matilda, and Violet dove behind rusted ore carts as slugs chewed through timber and splintered beams, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Violet pressed her face into Matilda's shoulder, her small body rigid with terror, her hands clamped over her ears. Matilda held her tight, shielding her with her body, whispering, it's all right, shh." Even though she was shaking so hard she could barely breathe. Shyla returned fire with the sharps, each shot deliberate, and spaced the recoil, bruising his shoulder. He counted his ammunition in his head, 7 rounds left, then 6, then 5. Not enough. Not nearly enough. A muzzle flash lit the entrance. Sparks leaped. The stack of copied ledger pages piled on a flat stone near the fire caught a stray ember. Flames licked up the edges, curling the paper black. Shyla lunged, grabbed the bundle, and yanked it free, the heat scorching his palms. Matilda threw her skirt over the rest, smothering the flames with her body, not flinching even as the heat bit through the cloth and singed her hands. "Move!" Shyla shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Deeper now. They scrambled into the darkness, into the branching passages, where the air grew colder and the firelight faded to nothing. Behind them, boots echoed on stone. Voices called out, careless and confident, the voices of men who believed they had already won. At the shaft's mouth, Arthur Pike tried to hold them off. He crouched behind a fallen timber, the old shotgun braced against his shoulder, and fired twice. The boom was deafening, the muzzle flash bright as lightning. The first shot went wide. The second took a man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a scream. But Arthur was a farmer, not a fighter, and his cover was poor. A rifle cracked once, sharp and final. Arthur jerked, stumbled, and fell, blood spreading dark and fast across his shirt. Shyla reached him, first grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him backward into the mine, away from the entrance, away from the line of fire. Arthur's face was gray, his breath shallow and whistling. Blood pulsed between Matilda's fingers as she pressed her hands to the wound, trying to stanch the flow, her face wet with tears. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Arthur. Please hold on." But the blood kept coming hot and slick, and Arthur's eyes fluttered closed. Winifred, who had been hiding in the back passages with Violet, panicked. Fear and duty tore at her in equal measure. She could hear the gunfire, the shouts, the sound of boots on stone, and she knew that if she stayed, they would all die here in the dark. She ran, not away but toward town, hoping to summon help to bring Irene to do something. But Calder's men caught her at the canyon mouth, where the trail narrowed between rock walls. Calder himself was there, and he grabbed her wrist and twisted until the bone creaked, and she cried out. "Thank you kindly," he said, smiling thin and cold. "You just saved me the trouble of tracking you all." He followed her back, using her as a shield and a guide, and the trap closed tighter. They evacuated at dusk, carrying Arthur on a door plank, torn from the mine's inner supports. Shyla led his rifle slung across his back. Violet perched on his shoulders with her arms wrapped tight around his neck. Matilda and Irene followed, carrying the makeshift stretcher between them, Arthur's face gray and slick with sweat, his breath shallow and bubbling. They moved through cottonwoods, toward the San Pedro River, the air cooling fast as the sun dipped below the mountains. The current ran high and fast, swollen from distant rains in the high country, and the water was black as oil in the failing light. Moonlight silvered the surface, turning it into a ribbon of glass that hissed and roiled. Behind them, Calder's men opened fire from the bank. Bullets kicked up spray, snapping through the air with deadly precision, thumping into tree trunks and skipping off the water like stones. Shyla waded in first, the cold hitting him like a fist to the chest, stealing his breath. He lifted Violet higher onto his shoulders, one hand clamped tight around her ankle, the other braced against the current. The water surged to his waist, then his chest pulling at his legs with the strength of a living thing. Matilda followed, gripping his belt with white-knuckled fingers, her skirt dragging in the current, the weight of it threatening to pull her under. The cold was a shock, numbing and brutal, and she gasped, her lungs seizing. A round split the water inches from Violet's calf. The child screamed, lost her grip, and started to slide. Shyla pivoted hard, taking the full force of the current against his chest, and hauled her back up with both hands, his boots slipping on the rocks beneath. He went to one knee, water surging over his shoulders, and shoved Violet higher, her hands scrabbling for purchase on his head, his hair. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice raw. Matilda stumbled, her foot catching on a submerged branch. She went under the current, dragging her downstream. She came up, choking her lungs, burning her arms, flailing. Shyla reached back his hand, finding her wrist by instinct, and he placed it over his own, a tether, a lifeline, and hauled her forward step by brutal step bullets, whipping the water around them, the current a living enemy, trying to drag them all to their deaths. They reached the far bank and dragged themselves up into the reeds, shaking and gasping, water streaming from their clothes. Violet clung to Shyla's neck, sobbing, and Matilda collapsed beside them, coughing up river water, her whole body trembling. Behind them the shooting continued, but they were out of effective range now, hidden by the reeds and the darkness. Climax Phase 2. The trestle. They scrambled up the embankment toward the rail trestle, a skeletal span of iron and wood that crossed the river 50 yards downstream. A freight train was approaching from the east, its whistle splitting the night, the engine's headlamp, a single yellow eye cutting through the dark. Calder's riders charged the shallows, water spraying from their horses' hooves, the animals snorting and wild-eyed. Shyla hustled Matilda and Violet beneath the trestle, weaving between the timber supports, and grabbed a coil of telegraph wire left abandoned by repair crews. He looped it around a beam, stretched it taut across the planks at knee height, and tied it off. A horse clattered onto the trestle. Shyla yanked the wire tight. The horse's front legs caught tangled, and the animal went down hard, screaming, throwing its rider into the driftwood below. The man hit with a sickening crunch and did not move. Smooth Sam cursed, raised his Winchester 1873, and fired. The bullet punched through a timber inches from Matilda's head, and she flinched, pressing herself flat against the beam. She still had Arthur's pocket pistol, and she raised it with shaking hands, sighted down the short barrel, and fired. The recoil nearly tore the weapon from her grip, but the shot hit true, and the Winchester 1873 spun from Sam's hands and clattered across the planks. He dove for cover, swearing as the train roared past the noise and wind, swallowing everything, the ground shaking beneath them. When the train was gone, the night rang with a silence so complete, it felt like being underwater. They limped back toward Bitter Creek at dawn, battered and exhausted, not to flee, but to finish what they had started. Marshal Harlan stepped off the morning train, with 2 deputies summoned by Samuel's mangled wire, and a second more detailed telegram sent from Green Valley on suspicion. Harlan was a tall man with a graying beard, sharp eyes, and the kind of presence that made even honest men nervous. He wore a federal badge on his vest and carried a Winchester across his saddle. He met Calder in the middle of the main street, and the sun just rising, casting long shadows across the dust. Calder smiled easy and confident, his hand resting on his own rifle. "Marshal, glad you're here. We've got ourselves a situation. Apache kidnapper took a white woman and her child right out of town. Dangerous man. I've been tracking him for days." Matilda stepped forward from the boardwalk, dirt-streaked and hollow-eyed, her dress torn and stained with blood that was not her own. She raised the torn ledger page, her hand steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "That's a lie," she said, her voice clear and strong. Shyla dropped the crate of letters at Harlan's feet. The wood splintered on impact and the papers spilled across the dust, dozens of letters, lies, written in elegant script. Dr. Irene stepped forward, her face set with grim determination. "I've treated bruises, broken bones, women who were too afraid to speak. I'll testify to it all." Winifred Hale, her eyes red, but her voice steady, pointed at the rusty nail with a shaking hand. "There are more. A whole room full of ledgers, names, debts, lies." Marshal Harlan's expression hardened. He gestured to his deputies. "Search it. Every room, every desk." Miles went pale. His hand darted toward the derringer, hidden in his waistcoat. Shyla saw the motion, the shift in weight, the flicker of intent, and moved without hesitation. He knocked Miles's wrist aside as the gun snapped, the report sharp and flat. The bullet went wide and hit Samuel Mercer. The telegraph operator had stumbled from the depot, bruised and bloodied, his face swollen, his shirt dark with dried blood. He had come to see if his wire had mattered, if the marshal had come, if any of it had been worth the beating. The bullet took him in the chest, high and center, punching through lung and bone. Samuel fell, his breath bubbling, and he grabbed Shyla's sleeve with ink-stained fingers as he went down. His spectacles cracked and held together with wire slipped from his face. "It got through," he whispered, blood on his lips. "Didn't it? It got through." Shyla caught him as he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. "It did." Samuel smiled, a small broken thing. His eyes went dim. His hand slipped. He died without speeches, without fanfare, just a final exhale, and the slow release of tension and the weight of a deed done. The street froze. Every eye turned to Miles, who stood pale and shaking the derringer smoking in his hand. Marshal Harlan's voice was cold. "You're done." The deputies kicked in the saloon's back office door. Boxes spilled, ledgers tumbled across the floor, named some signatures. The numbers matched Matilda's torn page. Every lie, every debt, every woman trapped by words on paper. Calder swore fired a wild shot that took splinters from the saloon's wall and spurred his horse toward the back alleys, leaning low over the animal's neck. Shyla ran after him on foot, his legs burning his lungs, screaming his side, aching from the shallow knife wound that still bled. He was not faster than a horse. But he knew the town, every alley, every dead end, every shortcut. He angled through the narrow lanes, vaulted over a water trough, climbed onto the roof of the smithy with hands and boots scrambling for purchase, and dropped into Calder's path at the back lane where barrels and crates narrowed the run. They collided. Calder's knife flashed a wicked curve of steel. Shyla twisted, felt the blade slice shallow across his ribs, a line of fire, and clamped Calder's wrist against the iron hub of a wagon wheel. Wood and metal bit into flesh. He twisted, putting his weight behind it, until Calder's fingers spasmed and the knife fell with a clatter. Shyla held him there, breathing hard, his face inches from Calder's, his grip iron. He could have killed him. Should have by every law of survival. But he chose restraint, chose to let justice be justice, not vengeance. The marshal's deputies arrived, clapped irons around Calder's wrists, and hauled him away. Grigory Karpov, faced with a federal marshal and 2 deputies standing over his desk, sang like a caged bird. He gave them everything: receipts, telegraphs, names of buyers in Denver and San Francisco who paid for referrals, records of payoffs to local law documentation of every lie he had penned. He wept as he did it, pleading for leniency, for understanding, claiming he had been only a clerk, only following orders. The marshal was unmoved. Miles blustered, then wept, then blustered again. The charges were read: trafficking, fraud, conspiracy, and murder in the death of Baptiste Laurent by reckless blasting. The evidence was overwhelming. The trial would be a formality. The town split. Some, the ones who had profited, who had looked away, slunk off into the alleys or boarded the next train east. Many stood straighter, their faces set, their voices rising for the first time in years. Samuel Mercer was laid out at the depot, his body washed and dressed in his best shirt. Winifred Hale placed a chalk stub in his folded hands, a small, quiet gesture that said he had been a teacher as much as a telegrapher. A man who had helped her learn the code, who had been kind when kindness was scarce. The town paid for a plain pine coffin and a grave on the hill overlooking Bitter Creek. 40 people attended the burial, and Reverend Coles spoke words about courage and sacrifice that rang hollow, but were spoken all the same. Arthur Pike survived. Dr. Irene said he would limp, that the wound would ache in the cold, but that he would keep his land and his life. He grinned through the pain, his weathered face creasing, and said, "Reckon that's fair. I got off lighter than most." Matilda and Violet sat on the clinic stoop as the sun dipped low, turning the sky orange and gold and purple. The heat of the day was fading, replaced by the cool breath of evening. Violet dozed against her mother's side, her small face peaceful for the first time in days, her hand still clutching the beaded ring. Shyla stood nearby, his shirt dark with blood from the shallow wound at his ribs, his arms crossed, his eyes always measuring, always watchful. He had not slept. He would not until he was certain the danger had passed. Matilda rose slowly, her body aching, and walked to him. She reached for the makeshift bandage at his side, the cloth soaked through and dark. Her hands were steadier now, steadier than they had been in years. "Let me," she said quietly. He did not protest. She unwrapped the cloth with careful, tender motions, revealing the wound, a shallow slice, angry and red, but already beginning to close. She cleaned it with water from the pump, her touch gentle, and rewrapped it with fresh linen Irene had left. Their faces were inches apart. She hesitated, her hand stilling, and then she rested her forehead briefly against his shoulder, a gesture of gratitude, exhaustion, and something deeper that neither had words for yet. He did not move away. His hand came up, rested lightly on her back, and stayed there. "Thank you," she whispered. "You already said that. I'll say it again." He almost smiled. Almost. A marshal's search of the gold dust mine office, conducted 3 days later, turned up a tin box hidden beneath floorboards in the foreman's quarters. The box was stamped with the initials B.L. Baptiste Laurent. Inside, a miner's notebook, its pages stained with rock dust and sweat, filled with notes on ore quality shift schedules, and at the back a will scratched in pencil. "To Matilda Quinn, all I have for our daughter Violet. I was promised a clean shaft and given a powder dump. If you read this, know I loved you both. Baptiste Laurent, witnessed by Bartholomew Pierce, foreman." The marshal found Pierce in Green Valley working as a surveyor and brought him back to Bitter Creek to testify. Pierce confirmed the signature, confirmed the will, and testified that he had been fired by Miles 2 days after Baptiste's death for asking too many questions about the accident. The box also held a folded paper, a common law marriage recognition, signed by the mining camp's magistrate at Deadman's Gulch. It was legal enough to matter to give Matilda and Violet claim to whatever Baptiste had left behind, which was not much, but it was something. More importantly, it was proof. Proof that Baptiste had loved them. Proof that he had tried to protect them. Proof that Violet was not fatherless, not forgotten. Matilda read the will with tears streaming her hands, shaking so hard she could barely hold the paper. She pressed the notebook to her chest and wept, not for what was lost, but for the proof that she had been loved, that her daughter had been wanted, that none of it had been a lie. Violet climbed onto the clinic step with her slate and the locket Matilda had given her, the one that held Baptiste's token from the mine. She watched Shyla and Matilda the way children do when they are deciding where safety lives, where home is. Matilda knelt, meeting her daughter's eyes, and spoke carefully. "I told you he was your father, so you'd be brave. But your real father was a miner named Baptiste. He loved you first. He loved us both. Do you understand?" Violet studied the locket, turning it over in her small hands. Then she looked at Shyla. "Can I still hold your hand?" Shyla offered it without hesitation. She took it, her small fingers wrapping tight around his thumb, and smiled. Parenthood by act, not blood. Family by choice, not claim. Marshal Harlan offered Shyla work as a tribal scout liaison, paid position with federal authority, to ride between jurisdictions to ensure that the next woman trapped by lies would have someone to turn to, someone who could bring the law without fear of local corruption. The work would be hard, the pay modest, but it was honest. Shyla accepted only after a glance at Matilda, a look that said, "I won't leave you cornered. I won't let you fall back into a cage." She met his eyes and nodded. "I'll learn to stand. I'll learn to be free." Months passed. Summer turned to autumn, and the air grew crisp and the sky a deeper blue. Matilda, stronger after rest and clean air and medicine Irene provided on credit she refused to call in, took up the writing desk in the small house Arthur helped her rent at the edge of town. She began answering letters for women moving west. Honest letters this time, truth in ink to counter the lies that had trapped her and so many others. She wrote with clarity and care, warning of dangers, offering resources, connecting women with honest work and honest men. The letters spread. Women wrote back thanking her, asking for more help. It became a business, small but steady. Arthur rigged a pump for her garden, trading water for eggs and vegetables. His arm healed crooked but functional, and he joked that it gave him an excuse to drink more coffee in the morning to loosen up. Winifred Hale took over the schoolhouse fully, her tremor fading as the fear lifted. She taught with a fiercer joy, and enrollment grew. Dr. Irene Fowler's practice thrived. With Miles's ledgers exposed and his hold broken, she treated patients openly, and her reputation spread. Women came from neighboring towns seeking her care. On Violet's 6th birthday in the spring, Shyla rode into town with a small package wrapped in cloth. He found Violet and Matilda in the garden behind their house planting seeds. He knelt in the dirt exactly where Violet had first run to him in the street, though this ground was softer, kinder, and unwrapped the package. Inside was a beaded ring, the same pattern as the one Violet had clutched the day they met. White for protection, red for courage, turquoise for home. "For you," he said simply and held it out. Violet took it with both hands, her eyes wide. "Does this mean we're family?" "We already were," he said. "This just makes it official." She slipped the ring onto her thumb, beaming, and threw her arms around his neck. Matilda watched her throat tight, her eyes burning. She had never expected this, had never dared to hope for it. Not rescue, not safety, and certainly not this, a man who stayed because he chose to, who loved her daughter because she was worth loving. who looked at Matilda herself not as something broken, but as someone whole. When Violet ran off to show Arthur her ring, Shyla stood and turned to Matilda. They stood close, the spring sun warm on their faces, and he reached for her hand. She took it. "I don't have much," he said quietly. "The work takes me away sometimes. But I'll always come back." "That's enough," she said, her voice steady. "That's more than enough." He leaned in slow and deliberate, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Their lips met, brief, chaste, a promise more than passion. And when they pulled back, they were both smiling. Bitter Creek at sundown. No parade, no ceremony, no grand declarations. Just a street swept clean by wind, the buildings standing solid and familiar. And three figures walking together down the boardwalk, Shyla, Matilda, Violet, between them. Small hands clasped in theirs. The rusty nail stood empty, its doors chained, its windows dark. The sign hung crooked paint, peeling. It would be torn down by autumn and the lumber salvaged for something better. The telegraph ticked slow and steady at the depot, carrying ordinary talk freight schedules, weather reports, messages from families scattered across the vast and unforgiving West. Wind pushed grit down the street, soft and constant, the eternal breath of the high plains. Survival had made its own kind of promise. The ledger sat locked in a marshal's trunk in Green Valley, pages brittle but binding evidence of crimes that would send Miles and Calder to prison for the rest of their lives. And on Shyla's hand, on Violet's thumb, the beadwork shone plain and bright evidence of a family chosen not by blood or legend, but by deed and proof. And the simple, stubborn refusal to let cruelty have the last word. They walked together into the fading light, three souls bound by survival and choice. And the dust settled soft behind them, covering their tracks, leaving no trace but the memory of what they had fought for and won.